Welcome to the My Rules Are Better podcast. I'm Tom Barbalet. Today, look, how can you talk about solo wargaming without a guest? That was my theory. And I'd like to welcome on the host of Keep Off the Borderlands, one and only Spencer. Pleasure to talk to you today, Spencer.
Hello, Tom. It's a pleasure to be here.
In preparation for the show, I actually grabbed my copy of Keep on the Borderlands. And for folks listening in, the name of your podcast is beautifully referencing a manual written by Gary Gygax. No, a module written by Gary Gygax in the late 70s, I believe.
Yes, not one I've played, actually.
Oh, you haven't played it? Oh, my goodness. When I realised, I don't know when I realised the gritty funness of your podcast name, but when I did, I remembered that I actually had a copy. And I don't think I've actually seen my copy in, I don't know, the past 6 years, perhaps. But in preparation for this recording, because I thought it might be an interesting example of solo gameplay on an existing module, I found my copy of Keep on the Borderlands. And it was just as, I don't know, sentimental, let's say, as when I first purchased it all of maybe 7 or 8 years ago. For folks listening in who may not be aware of your show and your background, you're not a wargamer, right? You're a role player primarily.
No, that is correct. Yes, I am a role player.
So no miniature addiction?
I'm afraid not. I had a few miniatures back in the day, back in the mid-'80s, just a handful of miniatures, but that's not something I've returned to.
Interesting. So that part of the hobby, let us just say, will move to one side. But it was interesting, actually, because I came to this topic, I guess I've solo gameplayed in some regard when I test out rules. We're going to talk a little bit more about that, associated with your own solo gameplay experience. But as you come to this thing, you live in my understanding is a relatively remote part of Scotland. Do you have a friendly local game store or anything like that? Or is most of your gaming with people from afar or solo?
Yes, it's online. Essentially, I game with people dotted around Europe and the US. And unfortunately, I believe my nearest gaming shop is in Inverness, which is just over 30 miles from here. And I'd never been in there.
Interesting.
All my purchases have been via the post.
Interesting. Yeah, my nearest gaming store that I know about is about 15 miles away, but it might as well be the end of the earth. So I reflect very thoroughly that, I remember recording a podcast called No Nappies, which I think touched a few people, touched you in particular as well. And one of the things that I reflected on about that was that we need to be thinking about wargaming retirement communities or gaming retirement communities. And I have a friend who has land in Canada, and I pointed him to the podcast and said, make this happen for your Canadian land. And in terms of the hobby, do you do any solo gameplay?
I've dabbled. I'm by no means an expert, but I've tried several times with mixed results. But I have looked into it quite extensively.
So when you get a new rule set before you play it, what's your process associated with solo gameplay?
Well, partly, you may or may have not been aware that I have not run a game. I've never actually GM'd. I'm the forever player. And part of my recent kind of interest in solo gaming is to basically get a little bit of GMing experience under my belt.
Interesting.
And, just test myself really before taking myself out on the road, unleashing myself on a party.
In terms of your process, I mean, when I started thinking about this as a topic, my thought was the joy that I get out of gaming is with an online group, for example, and I do solo gameplay and testing, but what's your standard process? Like, if you get a new rule system, are you going to solo play it, and how do you explore that?
Well, I wouldn't say I have a standard process as such. I've tried various methods. I would generally, the first thing I like to do is roll up a character and maybe sort of pit them against something. kind of generate maybe some do a little sort of some small scale world building, perhaps roll up a few locations and stuff like that, and then set out to explore in that sense. I have looked into solo gaming, and there's quite a few really interesting YouTube channels. One called Geek Gamers in particular, that's full of really great tips. And in fact, they put out a book recently called the Solo Game Master's Guide, which I believe is available as a PDF on Drive-Thru. It's distributed through Modiphius. And anybody, I would recommend that to anybody who wants to know what this is all about, really. But what interested me as a player is exploration, and it's very difficult to surprise yourself. So I do look to employ random tables quite heavily in the sense of, just trying to throw up interesting situations to deal with.
One of the things that fascinated me about Keep on the Borderlands was, I guess I'm looking to this from a kind of nostalgia perspective, although there are a few games that interest me for solo gameplay. And what I think interested me was the idea of taking an existing rule system, both in one case a wargaming rule system and in maybe 3 or 4 cases role-playing games, and then what was necessary in order to, as you say, the surprise element. Keep on the Borderlands fascinated me because rather than a very detailed map that showed treasure and, skeletons and gnolls and all the things on the map, it was very much in the kind of fighting fantasy choose your own adventure where each of the rooms within the dungeon was numbered. And then you'd come to a numbered dungeon. So you wouldn't have any knowledge that if you were in room 3 and you moved into room 4, the treasure and the gnolls are in room 4 because it wasn't actually on the map. So I think that interested me in... part of my background to actually talking about solo gameplay is that I have so many rule systems. And just a means of going back and nostalgically looking at these rule systems. And I put a video online before we had this conversation of 2 of the Palladium games that interest me for solo gameplay.
Did watch that, and very interesting it was in 2.
Neither of them have an explicit solo path, and I think some of the modern game systems actually, they explicitly have solo paths that you can use if you want to, explore the game system in a solo sense. Both of the rule systems I explored in the video have scenario books, which, unlike the Keep on the Borderlands where you have a map and scenarios applicable, you have to read a lot of background and detail. I came to this topic also by looking at a YouTube channel called Paint All the Minis, with regards to wargaming specifically. And what they detailed on Keep All the Minis was having a series of cue cards. In fact, I'm using these cue cards as we talk as well, as a means of dividing potential behaviors into 3 possible directions. And then at any given time going down the list of directions and picking that. And that was their randomizing elements, almost a kind of pre-written randomization. But certainly looking at things like old school D&D and the Palladium books and these kind of things, the ability to have pre-existing, dungeons or campaigns or what have you, almost is at the point of kind of choose your own adventure capacity. In terms of your random tables, what do your random tables, do you have game examples that you solo game play, and do you have random table examples from those games?
Well, one game that I've enjoyed playing solo is Into the Odd, and there are quite a lot of random tables, and also by extension Electric Bastion Land, which is kind of like the follow-up to Into the Odd, but it's much more of a toolkit, which sort of full of prompts and methods for creating locations and content and stuff like that. So, that's very helpful.
It's very much a randomizing universe. I seem to recall certainly our mutual friend Barney talk about it, and it struck me that a majority of the game was actually created through randomization.
Well, yes, it's one of these games that I'd say it has an implied setting. And a lot of the, there's no sort of extensive fiction or background, a lot of the world is presented as bullet points, and kind of everybody's going to have a different take on what this world actually turns out to consist of.
I mean, what was interesting looking back through Keep on the Borderlands was it gave a lot of detail associated with what the role the Games Master should take through the game. And I think one of these things about solo gameplay is a kind of blurring of the line between player and Games Master. But if the role can be, as you say, randomized or given kind of discrete interactions that you can move through, then solo gameplay becomes considerably easier, I think. Part of this is also to do with ritual as well. And certainly when I look at the games that I played with people, it's the rituals that I return to that are, central to the gaming. What is your standard ritual for solo gameplay? Can you do it in bed with, your partner beside you, or is it something where you need a dedicated table and dedicated time?
Yes, I would have to take myself away and dedicate some time to it, which, yes, I mean, I'd love to be able to, say, play in bed or be able to play on a plane or something like that, but I feel I'm not so organised as to be able to do that. I like to surround myself with things, lists, papers, tables to roll on, and paraphernalia.
So you'd set aside time, you'd set aside dice, you'd set aside paperwork, and you put these things in front of you, and then one of the things that I enjoy about the GMing process is that I'm constantly rolling dice. Not necessarily to spook probability out of the players, but just, in my own mind, I'm like, well, there's a percentage of that happening or that happening or that happening. Let me roll to see what happens. More a kind of internal narrative of probability, which the players occasionally get to touch upon. Do you maintain this is your solo gameplay as well? Are you constantly in a state where you're rolling actively to get a sense of what's going on?
Well, yes. I mean, partly that's part of the pleasure of doing it is the rolling of dice to, as I say, surprise myself with what I might end up facing, how well I might be able to cope with it. It's interesting because it's almost like you're shifting positions from being the player to being the GM. And sometimes, if you know too much about the situation you're in, you have to treat the character as the more random element, if that makes sense.
Certainly. And yeah, it's a beautiful kind of blurring of the line. Now, I guess as we're recording this in the My Rules Are Better podcast, part of this is also the ability to expand some of the rules that I've already gotten out for solo gameplay and how explicit one needs to be. I've been looking at a game called Zona Alpha, which is really Osprey's version of my Just Plain Chaos rule system, and it has interesting sections where it assumes the player is addicted to miniatures, where it assumes the player has a long-standing history of buying excessively with regards to, and they kind of almost goat you in saying, we know you already have this addiction, so don't worry, just bring the miniatures that you already have, that you're already addicted to. But the nature of solo gameplay here is considerably different because it's the maturity you have as a player is one thing, but you have to discard a good portion of that. Let's take Electronic Bastion Land as an example. Very random with regards to the actual creation of characters, right? You have a bunch of different possibilities, and so that seems to write itself in terms of it being randomized. The character behavior, do you look at distinct behaviors like irascibility and compliance with commands? The person is likely to do things that they're told to do, or they will go independently and do a bunch of additional things. What kind of tables are you using for actual, self-player, for want of a better term here, behavior in this circumstance?
Well, I do kind of have, when I create the character, I sort of imbue them with certain qualities. But it is possible to, I've got a good example here. There's a book called Cairn, which is in fact like a fantasy hack of Into the Odd. And it's actually got, when you're creating a character, you can roll, on character traits like the physique, the attitude, even how they might speak.
Certainly.
Vice's reputation and things like that, which is very handy for, creating a variety of characters if indeed you want to create a party of characters when you play solo.
Certainly. Do you have a limit for playing solo? Like after 3 characters, it just becomes too schizophrenic, or what's the maximum number of characters you've ever played in a solo game?
Using Into the Odd, I think, it was Electric Bastion Land, and I rolled up 4 characters.
Wow, okay.
One of the characters, in fact, was actually a group of 5 urchins in that operated as one character.
Interesting.
They've kind of in like a sort of in a trench coat type configuration, which is one of the more quirky characters that you can roll up in Electric Bastion Land. And I took them through a dungeon that was probably only about half a dozen rooms.
Interesting.
So because it was that sort of limited space, I probably decided to create a larger party than I normally would. Mm-hmm. If I'm thinking more open-endedly, I'd probably create one character and then perhaps create a contact or like a retainer or some kind of sidekick and see where they get up to. Also possibly creating an antagonist as well at the same time that's placed somewhere else in the world.
And the term urchin here has multiple meanings. I realised that as you were saying it. Do you mean like a street hustler, or do you mean a mollusk? Yes. Okay, not a mollusk.
No. Small children, yes. Kind of a bunch of Oliver Twists, if you like.
Very good. To be Dickensian. Perfect. So when I framed this as a potential topic for this podcast, I know the podcast actually started talking about aspects of solo gameplay and aspects of how to maintain a game solo, but it takes this podcast in a completely different direction. And I'm interested actually in recording, follow-ups as I've experimented. Palladium, how does it play out? Advanced D&D through also using, Keep on the Borderlands is a beautiful example because it's a basic D&D. It's not an advanced D&D module. So playing through these kind of modules, and historically, for example, when I did the game at work, which was a 5th edition D&D game, I used first edition modules, some basic modules even, and just expanded them accordingly. I think the nature of being a seasoned player of these games and then moving into solo gameplay is not necessarily a difficult step, but for new people that are getting into these games and maybe isolated, COVID was probably a wonderful time for solo gameplay really to start moving, and I know a number of the YouTube channels that are about this topic, saw their membership rise dramatically through COVID because obviously it was, but now many of us are just feeling isolated even though COVID is over. So for folks who are interested in starting out, how would you recommend? Would you recommend a game like Electric Bastion Land just because it lends itself very heavily, or do you think anyone can pick up almost any role-playing game and move it to solo relatively easily?
Yeah, technically speaking, you could probably, solo any role-playing game. Personally, I favour lighter rule sets, but there's no reason why something more crunchy wouldn't work. In fact, something more. Thinking about basic D&D, there is a very definite structure to play. A procedure of play.
Yes,
that I think lends itself to solo gaming, and maybe starting out. I know it's a great way to learn a system.
Yes,
but if you're familiar with the system already, that might be easier. I think possibly the most important thing is it being a setting that you want to explore.
Most definitely. That's what returns me to the nostalgia point. The games that I'm looking to explore are all older games that I already own and just want to either return to something, which was certainly the No Nappies discussion too, but also just potentially get the reverence of the old. I mean, I certainly found that as I was looking through the, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles rules, for example, the Palladium rules for TMNT, and also the Robotech rules. But these were two rule systems which I had actually played historically, but I just had a reverence for the setting and the rules, and I wanted to get into that kind of mindset. What interests me is the distinction between rules reading and actual solo gameplay. Have you ever had a situation where you've played solo and your character has either been killed or lost dramatically or had some really, negative life-changing event occur with it?
Well, actually, the dungeon I played through, the whole party actually got wiped out.
Gosh.
So there's that.
Even in a small dungeon. Yeah, so it must have been a particularly savage small dungeon.
It was, or just maybe maybe just poor management of the party on my part. But so that wasn't too, that was a bit of an experiment, and I wasn't really intending to extend it beyond that one session anyway. So
interesting.
The fact that it was a total party kill was not really that much of a problem. I did. In a more open-ended kind of a thing that's still ongoing in a way, I've it's kind of paused in my head where these characters are. But I started out with two characters, and one of them was actually taken out in the second encounter.
Gosh,
and that it was interesting. It was certainly something I wasn't expecting, but it certainly didn't put a crimp on the game. Fortunately, the other characters survived long enough to encounter somebody else who was able to join them on the journey.
Very cool. Very cool. So, for folks interested in getting started, what's your primary recommendation? Should they read the rule system and then put themselves in the setting? Obviously, you've recommended one book from the YouTube channel associated with solo gameplay. What do you think the prescription is here?
Well, probably as a player, I've often made the mistake of creating a character and then thinking, and they sort of exist in isolation initially. So it's probably good to imagine first where you want your character to be. Then create the character, drop them into
the scenario.
The scenario. One tip to kind of get the ball rolling is to perhaps look at some either the gaming book itself that you're using, or maybe some fiction that of a similar tone or setting. And I'd consider rolling up, say, grabbing a bunch of D10s, rolling up a random page number, flicking through, finding a paragraph or something, and perhaps looking at that and seeing if you could utilize that as a jumping off point. Take elements from the literature and try and weave some kind of narrative out of that, some situation.
That's fascinating. So randomizing the resultant point that you then start generating from. Interesting.
And after that, I think that's when the structure of play comes in, and you essentially, I wouldn't worry too much about it feeling too board gamey, if that makes any sense.
Certainly.
Because if that helps to keep the momentum going, then it all comes out in the wash, as it were.
Very good. Very good. Well, I think you've given a number of fascinating initial steps, Spencer. Thank you very much for coming on the podcast. In terms of this podcasting game that we're a part of, do you have any thoughts about the direction that you're... my understanding is that Anchor has stopped the voicemail element. People are still submitting audio. Is that correct?
Yes. I mean, the Anchor messages was a big part of my episodes. I would always kick off the episodes by going through the voicemails I'd received. I have set up an alternative way to contact me through something called SpeakPipe.
Interesting.
But as it's an additional step to leave the message, that seems to be just enough to put people off leaving messages.
Interesting.
I certainly feel that way when reaching out to other podcasts that I listen to that I regularly contact. My contacting them has dropped off quite significantly since the ease of leaving messages has been removed.
Yes, it was an interesting thing. I mean, obviously, you've heard me narrate the Anchor format versus my historical way of doing podcast submissions, but I'm now also actively tracking, listeners coming in, which in the past I did periodically with certain podcasts. My substantial podcast, Model Rail Radio, in terms of just length of time and number of listeners, I maintain, which is a call-in format. I mean, that's fundamentally the same thing as what Anchor was doing, but rather than having kind of time-independent call-ins, people need to call into Model Rail Radio when it's specifically being recorded. But it is interesting watching the kind of changing in podcasts. What the answer kind of machine element of your Anchorcast was really central to devising the format. So I'm interested in seeing what happens, whether you become, as I have to be on My Rules Are Better, a kind of independent narrator associated with these things, or whether the format will continue to evolve. Have you thought of, I'm not sure how many months it's been since the voicemail leaving facility was removed from Anchor, but what's your sense of how your podcast will evolve given what has happened so far?
I guess it is a shame that element has dropped off. I still get the occasional message, and I do find that does prompt episode content. Mm-hmm. I have found it. I've found it more difficult to release episodes, and that's become less frequent recently. Yes. I don't think that's particularly connected with the messaging, although sometimes if the messages have piled up a bit, that's impetus to try and get an episode out.
Certainly.
But I've got stuff in mind that I want to talk about over the next couple of episodes. It's just a matter of finding the time to actually do it.
Yes.
I think it does take me a little longer to put episodes together than yourself, as I would call your approach more a guerrilla approach. You had a thought in mind, you record it, and you put it out as an episode. And
that's the way I try to do it.
That's great. And it's really, really nice to listen to.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Format, but it's not something I feel that I have a talent for. My talent is more with the rambling and editing.
Yes. The whole podcast recording time for me is a luxury, as it is for my ability to talk to you currently. So my perspective is that when I have the luxury of time, I try to utilize the luxury of time as much as possible. And if that's a 6-minute podcast on a particular idea, that's a 6-minute podcast, or a 14-minute podcast, or a 20-minute podcast if I have the luxury of time. But no, it fascinates me. Obviously, our mutual friend Barney is not done as many podcasts as I think either of us might particularly want from him in the recent past.
Indeed.
And, the motivation behind it, I reflect on this heavily. I mean, even though I talked about Model Rail Radio, it's as much a group of friends getting together on a regular basis, having a good chinwag than it is anything. And sometimes there's internal politics and stuff that's just associated with middle-aged men friendships that comes into that as well. And it's interesting doing two very distinct kinds of podcasts. I used to do a buddy podcast as well for the longest period of time, one in one format, one in another format, and one in a kind of third format. But the ability to record with someone on a regular basis also changes the nature of the podcast format. So I'm interested to see the direction that Keep Off the Borderlands takes going forward, particularly since the voicemail parts. It's more associated with, as you note, I wouldn't even call your podcast Ramblecast. I think that's a bit too offensive in the circumstances, but I do really enjoy when you get jamming on a particular topic. So I'm certainly listening with some degree of interest to see what happens, and my hope is that
thank you.
My hope is that Barney will record more podcasts soon, and he's just going through whatever he's going through currently.
Yes.
Well, thank you very much, Spencer. I know it's been a brief chat, but just the luxury of time, I think you've left a lot of food for thought. Hopefully, based on listeners' missions and maybe future thinking, we could do this again sometime.
Oh, that would be great. This has been a pleasure, and thank you for having me on, Tom.
Pleasure as always, Spence. Please continue to produce the great content that I thoroughly enjoy. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Cheers.